Okay, I think we'll start. I'm going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so about the Eurozone crisis, and I hope you've read the two pieces that I asked you to read. We'll talk about those later on. I've got a PowerPoint, and then when we come to those two pieces that you were asked to read, one of them I'm going to ask you to give me some of your thoughts about that. I'll tell you more about that later. Before I start the presentation, Con mentioned one of his last slides. Mario Draghi was up there, President of the European Central Bank. I hope you've spotted that every month the ECB and the Bank of England on the same day, always a Thursday, announce their decisions on interest rates. That decision's coming up on Thursday of this week. And I strongly recommend that you look at the ECB website. It's possible they actually put translations up there. But anyway, you can see the press conference, recording of the press conference that Draghi gives with the president of the Romanian Central Bank, because he's the vice president to Draghi, ecb.int/press. And it's fantastic. So he makes a statement, Draghi makes an opening statement, and then there are questions and answers. And it's very, I think you might find it instructive to see the kinds of questions and the sort of attitude that the journalists have towards Draghi. This is the one from a month ago, 4th of July. They're quite robust, they're quite challenging. We haven't got time, and indeed the audio isn't set up, I don't think, to watch it. It'd be fun if we could. So I recommend that you do that this week, on Thursday or later, because they put up a recording. That's important because the ECB is central to the whole bailout process which has been going on, and which is what I'm talking about today. Okay, you knew in advance we were talking about the Eurozone bailouts. And I mentioned yesterday I would hope that you were looking at the news from the wider world. There was a story overnight out of Washington which is central to what we're talking about today, about Greece. Anybody tell me what that was, please? Nobody spotted it. There was also a story out of Washington about Ukraine. Nothing to do with the bailouts. Did anybody spot that? Nobody spot. The IMF made a statement about Ukraine. More monitoring. Exactly. Well, okay. So Irina had at least the idea. Yeah. So let's quickly look at those two stories. This is the one about Greece, which I was hoping you would have spotted. I think the IMF must have had a busy day yesterday because these two things came out. Maybe they made other statements. The point is that the money, which will be in my PowerPoint, didn't all come in one rush to these 5 countries which got the bailouts within the Eurozone. But it's all subject to monitoring. So the same kind of monitoring which is going to happen in Ukraine, because Ukraine has a package from the IMF, is happening to the 5 countries within the Eurozone. Greece, they've done a bit of monitoring recently. They're happy, more or less. The Greek government had certain conditions to fulfill, as is the case in Ukraine. The problem in Ukraine is Ukraine apparently has not been fulfilling the conditions to do with energy prices. I think you're not paying enough for your gas. And the IMF's not happy, according to this story, the Ukraine story. Anyway, so they're happy about Greece, and what's the story overnight is that they've released another 1.7 billion euros to Greece. Just to fulfill the circle, complete the circle, I'll just show you the Ukraine story because I think you should. Just to really make the point that this isn't these issues and this process is not limited to the Eurozone. Okay, these are the 5 bailouts. They're not in any specific order, but I'm going to talk mostly about Cyprus because that's the most recent. It's actually the smallest, 10 billion. Ireland got 67.5 billion, Portugal 78, Spain Well, the package was 100 billion, but they're not taking all of it. And Greece, the biggest, they got that in 2 lots because the first one in 2010 proved not to be enough. A whole range of what are called austerity measures. Austerity means dark times, if you like. It means we're going to have to reduce the size of our spending. We're going to have to live more frugally. We're not going to be able to spend so much money at a government level, at a personal level also. What's happened in Greece is that they have been reducing state pensions. They've been firing state employees. They've even, because they don't have a very efficient tax collection system in Greece, but they do have a very efficient system of collecting people's electricity bills. So they found a way of adding an extra tax onto people's electricity bills because that was an effective system, computerized system. And of course the threat was you don't pay your extra tax, your electricity gets cut off. So there are all kinds of measures being enforced in Greece like that. What we'll talk about a bit later on is which country might be next. Some people talk about Slovenia because its state finances are not very solid. It may or may not need to be rescued. So EU is now 28 members since remind me, Croatia, yes. Croatia joined recently. 18 of them using the euro. The euro, of course, used slightly more widely in a number of little countries. My mother-in-law lives in Andorra, which is not in the EU, but does use the euro for obvious reasons. It's surrounded by France and Spain. It's a different country. It's a separate country. So there are a few other little places using the euro. I think Bosnia uses the euro as well, even though it's Bosnia-Herzegovina. Yes. Okay, so really this is about the euro and the single currency. Of course, the principal holdout, the non-member, is the UK, where we still have the pound. Okay, let's step back. How did we get to the euro? They created the single currency. The euro itself was launched in 1999. It actually became a currency in people's pockets in 2002. That was called notes and coins. So it existed for paper transactions, government transactions since 1999. Now, sorry, my slide's out of date. This is now 18. The whole issue around having a single currency was that you have to have a single monetary policy. You take away from the governments of the member states, the right to use the currency as an implement of fiscal policy. And this has been the big issue. It's a single interest rate. Governments can't use the interest rate as an instrument of policy because the interest rate is set by Mr. Draghi and his colleagues in Frankfurt every month. Remind me what the interest rate is from the European Central Bank. We said this yesterday.
0.5.
Right, 0.5. Yeah. And the other key point in the treaty that set up what was called economic and monetary union was that the deficit, the budget deficit of the member states using the euro should not be more than 3%. Well, we now know that Greece probably never had a 3%, even the day it joined. We'll come on to that, actually. So you probably have heard of the Troika. The Troika is this organization, which is involved in the bailouts. It's actually the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission.
Troika, like Russian Troika?
Yeah, exactly. 3-horse chariot. Yeah? That's what it means, isn't it, Troika? Yeah. What's droshky? Is that 2 horses? Droshky? Huh? Because in Vienna they have chariots with horse-drawn carts, which they call... It's part of it, is it? Okay. Oh, is it? Okay, okay, that's different. All right. Anyway, yes, troika. So that's the word widely used in all the reports. These guys go in as a team and they sort out the economy. Yeah, this is just to say, okay, do we understand the difference between deficit and debt? Okay, tell us what's the difference.
You mean budget deficit?
Indeed.
So it's incomes minus
Expenditure.
yeah.
That's the deficit on the annual budget of a country.
Can be that can be longer period.
And yes, by contrast, the debt is the accumulated shortfall in the state finances. So both of them, that 3% limit, which I mentioned under the Maastricht criteria, was applied to the deficit. So the budget deficit, the country should not be planning to have a deficit of more than 3% of GDP. They were. The government's debt, the accumulated debt, in Greece is now equal to 1.5 times the total GDP of the country. This is massive. And Italy is Italy, Portugal, well, you see the table there.
That's debt, not deficit.
This is the debt. This is the government debt, yeah.
Maastricht agreement has liquidation on debt.
Yes, and indeed, I think the next slide is the deficits. Sorry, these figures are a bit out of date, but the total 2011 for the Eurozone, the deficit was an average of 4.1 and was as high as 13 for Ireland. It's actually come down a lot in Greece already since 15.4 in 2009, come down to 9.1%, partly under the influence of the austerity measures imposed by the Troika. So those are the deficit figures. All of these were meant to be less than 3%. These are just some selected countries. It's not that, some of them are doing a lot better than that. And the UK, not part of the Eurozone, of course, is high, but coming down. Yes, and these are the deficits as a percentage of GDP. So we've seen the bailouts, programs of fiscal consolidation, meaning get in more of your tax revenue, and austerity. Austerity means reduced salaries, reduced pensions, hard times, basically. And because of the bailouts, high yields on government bonds have started to reduce. I think that's the debt. Yeah, anyway, so the upshot, I talked yesterday about how fixed income works, about how bonds work, about when people are negative about the prospects for a country, they're going to demand higher yields on that country's debt. That's come down quite a lot this week. It's probably a good time to mention the story that I asked you to look at, not the big one, the Financial Times. This is not actually a news story. I don't know if you realize this. It's a blog piece by one of their reporters from about a month ago. The point about this is he's speculating about which will be the next country to need a bailout, and he's doing it on the basis of bond yields. And what happened on the day he wrote this was that suddenly there were fears that Portugal would be the next country to need a bailout. Of course, already had one bailout, but the fear was that it would need another bailout. And he was basing this on the fact that the bond market, had suddenly pushed up yields on Portuguese debt. So he doesn't actually, I also mentioned yesterday, by the way, that we measure these yields by comparison to benchmarks, either the German or the US government bonds. Here, in the third paragraph, he says, this is the key point of the story. Portuguese bonds rose above 630 points above German bonds. That was a yield of something like 7.8%, because German yields are about 1.5. So the difference, if the difference is 630, was it? Some Chuck, I think, yesterday explained, basis point is 1/100th of a percentage point. So if it says 630 basis points, that means 6.3%. And the actual yield on Portuguese bonds at this point was 7.8. Today, it's come down. So the panic is over about Portugal, and it's come down to 6.4%. But a year ago, yield on Portuguese bonds was as high as 11.5. They reached 11.5. This is massive. The point is that it means that the market is setting that yield, and it means that the government can only borrow at that interest rate. If the market says we want a yield of 11.5% on Portuguese government paper, any new bonds which the Portuguese government chooses to issue, it will have to pay that much. And there's a general feeling that anything over about 6% on government bonds is unsustainable. It's very hard for a government to. But what about if Greece were to leave the euro? You know, a year or two ago, this was being discussed as a live option, really, until Mr. Draghi and his friends kind of came to the conclusion that this would not be a good idea. I mean, one issue, you know, we talked about Germany and its attitude, and actually Germany comes up in the other piece I asked you to look at about Cyprus also. But of course, the Germans, you go to Greece, you see quite a lot of Mercedes cars. Well, of course, Germany benefits from the resurgence of the Greek economy, of all the EU subsidies that have been flowing into Greece, because people can go out and spend their money on fancy cars. There was one feature on British television a year or so ago highlighting the problems for the ordinary people of Greece. And it was a feature about a man who'd had to sell his 4x4 because he couldn't afford the petrol anymore and had to buy a small ordinary car. Well, maybe some people in Ukraine, even some other in Portugal and Cyprus would think, well, he's not doing so badly if he had a 4x4. You know, the fact is that during the good years, people just filled their boots. This is an expression meaning, you know, they just sucked in all this money and they took advantage. And nobody asked too many questions. And even the Germans didn't ask too many questions because they were selling their BMWs and Mercedes. But it was only when the state finances really came into crisis after, in the wake of the global crisis in 2008, that the chickens came home to roost. That's the expression, meaning finally people had to account for the difficulties. So let's move on with Greece. This is the state of the debt compared to the Eurozone average. I think this is a bit different from the figure before, but it's forecast to be 174% of GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP, compared to the Eurozone average. So as I was saying, years of underreporting the figures, massaging of the statistics, hiding the real ratio. They were actually carrying on building up the deficit after 2001 when they should have been reducing it. And the bonds were finally downgraded to junk. Remember yesterday I showed you that table of, you know, AAA, investment grade, speculative grade. Speculative grade means junk, and that was when the Greek yields went up to, can't remember, 30 or 40% or something. Let's go quickly through some of the other countries. Ireland, people have not been rioting in the streets of Ireland. They've had to undergo some very similar treatment. Lots of people have lost their jobs. The issue in Ireland and with Spain was not so much the state finances, but it was the finances of some of the banks, and the banks having to be bailed out by the state. And in both cases, it was to do with property. In Spain and in Ireland, you can drive around and you can see huge housing estates that were built with speculative money in the 2000s with nobody living there, and all that construction was funded by the banks, and so the loans have gone sour. So Irish banks were downgraded to junk in 2011. But Ireland generally is regarded as the good pupil. It's swallowed the medicine. It can now issue bonds at a reasonable coupon again, and it's on the way to recovery. They did what's done in some other cases. Actually, Britain did it in the case of Northern Rock. You create what's called a bad bank. You have a good bank and a bad bank. So in the case of I think it was the Bank of Ireland, had these bad loans on its books, the kind of thing Con was talking about this morning. You split the bank up. You put all the bad loans into a kind of state-arranged entity with a complicated name in Irish, and you just kind of wind it down, really. You hope to sell those loans, or you just wait till they expire or whatever. So this National Asset Management Agency is the kind of bad bank. So you kind of rehabilitate the institution by taking all the bad stuff away, and that's a process that's gone on in some other places. So this is what Britain has done with Northern Rock. Quite a small bank, but it was the first casualty in 2008. So all the bad loans were put in one place, and the good bit was sold to Richard Branson and the Virgin Group. So it's now been rebranded Virgin Money. So that was how that process worked. The EU has ruled. Sorry, Con, we can.
Well, you care to comment on the guarantee that the Bank of Ireland, the government, threw under all of their banks' deposits during the height of the crisis, and the effect that had, the ripple effect that had throughout the EU, where you had other economies, you had a lot of money flowing into Ireland because of the guarantee. Other countries that were unable to do the same thing, feeling somewhat put out by the whole exercise.
So this is a reference to the fact that normally we have 100,000 euros guarantee, but in the case of Ireland, to stabilise the system, they made it a kind of unlimited guarantee. This is right, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, presumably the EU approved it as it approved this, so there are rules against that sort of state support. I don't know what the effect has been.
Well, they just, in the first instance, they went ahead and did it,
Mm.
and then that caused a scramble in the EU to come up with standards.
Mm.
So, I mean, for example, in the UK, where the financial sector is like 4 times GDP, some huge number,
Mm.
there was no capacity for the Bank of England to throw a similar guarantee under its banking system because it wouldn't be believable.
Mm.
But at the same time, all of this money was rushing to Ireland because it was a small country and they had issued this guarantee. So a lot of people think that contributed materially to the contagion effects of the crisis, where you had one country and then others going it alone.
Mm. Yes, well, there have been lots of distortions along the way, and I guess that's just one of them. I don't know that it's a live issue now. Although I have to admit, my savings account in England is actually with the post office, and the post office actually runs its accounts through the Bank of Ireland. So they're offering a decent interest rate in the UK in pounds, even though Ireland, of course, is a Eurozone country. Yeah, no, I can't take that any further, but it's an interesting angle, isn't it? The distortions that come up. Okay, Portugal, much smaller, but similar issues. Public sector employment, overemployment. This has been one of the issues also in Greece. You know, the public sector just grows. Maybe the case in Ukraine. Unemployment is 2.5% here, is it? Unemployment is about 2.5%, somebody told me. What?
It's on the official date.
Okay, but do they keep it low by giving lots of people government jobs? No?
Just it's a kind of a solid statistics that just problem with cards was kind of cheating, but
Right.
the real level of unemployment is up to 10%.
Oh, I see.
Actually, in Ukraine, we have two unemployment percentages. First one is official statistics, which 2.5%, which was mentioned. This is the number of officially registered unemployed people. But this is not, but there is the other statistics, which is calculated according to below methodology. And it's around 7%. It's around
Right.
6-7%. This is our unemployment level. This is according to this number, we can compare it to other countries' unemployment.
Well, it's not just Ukraine where they cheat the figures. Britain does the same. The official unemployment figures are actually called the claimant count, meaning the people who are claiming unemployment benefit. And you can only claim unemployment benefit under certain conditions. So it doesn't really represent the true extent of unemployment. So, yes, lots of governments do that kind of thing.
Yeah, in the U.S., we have two numbers, although we never give you two numbers. We have one number, but if somebody stops looking for work because they're too frustrated or don't have the training or they just stop looking for work, then they're not counted as unemployed anymore. Right?
Yeah.
And that way you can have two numbers, an official number and then this other funny number.
Yes, in Britain you can only claim the benefit if you're actively seeking work, which is not quite the same as being unemployed. Okay, it was interesting in Spain. Spain had a banking system that actually survived 2008 very well because it was well managed by the central bank. They didn't allow their banks to go in for the kind of dangerous instruments like the credit default swaps that caused the crisis. Spanish banks didn't do very much of that at all, but what they did do was invest in property, and they were funding huge amounts of property development, and that finally slumped with the recession. And so they, the two banks that had to be bailed out, Bankia and Banco Popular, and Catalonia is not a bank, but it's a province of Spain. It's the wealthiest province, and they're of course, they have a different language, they have a different culture in Spain. It's the northeast of Spain around Barcelona. And there's talk that because of the troubles of the rest of Spain, they will try to be independent. But that's, so that's a risk for the future with Spain. So the response within the EU was these two temporary mechanisms, 750 billion. Sorry, I'm moving on a bit quickly. This is now the permanent mechanism for a future bailout. The point is, the theory is that this 700 billion capital, finally approved last year by the Germans, will not be used. The point is that the mere fact that this fund is now available, this is a new thing, will kind of deter the market from ratcheting up government yields on a troubled country like Portugal or anywhere else. The fact is, we now know the money is available. If you think back 2 or 3 or 4 years, the arguments over Greece, huge amounts of complicated argument with particularly the Germans kind of resisting the idea of a bailout. And that was very negative for the whole picture, the whole delay. It's even clear from Cyprus, as we'll see in a minute, I hope, that the delay made the situation worse. So the point is that fund is now available for any future bailouts. And they hope, of course, that it will never be used. The other thing that's happened since September, OMTs, outright monetary transactions. This is the European Central Bank buying government bonds in the market. It's a bit like quantitative easing, which is the way the Fed and the Bank of England have been injecting money into the system, but with a different kind of philosophy, if you like. The European Central Bank doesn't believe in quantitative easing, partly under the influence of the Germans and their fear of inflation. The risk of quantitative easing is that you're putting money into the system and that can fuel inflation. I mentioned that the only law in economics I ever worried about was the law of supply and demand. The other law is the definition of inflation. The definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So if you put money into the system with quantitative easing, you risk generating inflation. Anyway, so what the ECB is doing is these transactions, so that kind of reduced the yields on the bonds of some of these more troubled countries, including Portugal, and so these countries can now borrow at a reasonable rate. This was the key quote from Draghi. We act strictly within our mandate to maintain price stability over the medium term. We act independently in determining monetary policy, and the euro is irreversible. There was speculation around this time last year that they would somehow abandon the euro or Greece would leave. This is Draghi saying, no, we're here to stay. And the market has complete confidence in him. I mean, other speakers have mentioned the importance of confidence. People have confidence in Draghi. So here are the bond yields. This is actually from, this is actually a year ago. Yeah, it's complicated because the light blue is Greece, but the axis is here, whereas the axis for all the others is over there. So Greek bond yields getting up to 30%, but the others not much more than 10 or 11. Is that? Yeah, that's Portugal at around 11. I was saying Portugal reached 11.5 at the peak. So bond yields have come down from some of these disastrous highs. This was Ireland, somewhere around 12%, now down to 6, something like that. So this is the reflection of the confidence of the market in those countries. Well, that's the whole issue of spreads. Okay, I'm going to move on now. We've really talked about some of these things. What are the solutions? We don't hear much about this now, but there was talk of issuing euro bonds. The point is that the ECB does not issue bonds. Germany, France, Italy, all the countries issue bonds, but the ECB does not issue its own bonds. And there was talk that one solution to the crisis would be that somehow we'll just kind of agglomerate everything and the ECB will do all the borrowing on behalf of the whole of the Eurozone. Not really viable because borrowers, lenders want to know what it is they're lending to. It's all about risk. Growth strategy, highly controversial in some countries. If you want growth, you've probably got to spend money, whereas that is contradictory to austerity. That's certainly the issue in Britain. Should they cut interest rates, raise interest rates, all on a knife edge now at around 0.5%? They could cut rates further to try and stimulate the economy, or the next move could be upwards, we don't know. The European Stability Mechanism, which I mentioned, that's the bailout fund. But on a political level, the response has been this new thing called the European Fiscal Compact. There will be much stricter limits. This is really a recognition that 3% deficit limit in the Maastricht criteria has failed. We've got a whole new set of rules now, making sure that we will adhere to fiscal stability. Well, this is my last session. It's been great working with you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much. And good luck for your future careers.